our storytelling or in our narratives that are there as well. And this what makes it such an important research method when we're actually looking at human experience, is this idea of actually moving beyond and sharing our own lived experiences that are there. So in the chat box as well, Eugenia is just about to put the slides in there, which is fantastic. So you can have a look at them as well as we go along. So I'm just really interested, is anyone thinking of using narrative, first of all, in their doctoral research?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Any other ideas or what people think about using narrative in their doctoral research?
Using it in mine, and I'm using for storylines across a longitudinal study.
Yeah, fantastic. Other comments, or have people thought about engaging narrative?
Hi, Susie, it's Julie. I don't have video either, but we've spoken before, and I can't use the constellations, but I'm hoping to use the analysis.
Definitely, because there's so many different types of narrative research out there. And it depends on what type of data you've collected and how you've actually collected it. I came into narrative research during my doctoral journey. So I had conducted a large-scale survey with teachers, but then I realised that while the data was telling a numeric story, there was actually the personal lived experience that was underneath. And so it was important for me to actually try and find more truth and understanding by talking to individuals about their actual lived experience. And my particular doctoral topic was in teacher self-efficacy, so their perceived capability as beginning teachers. So it was really important for me to talk to these beginning teachers to try and find out what their lived experience of. I had numeric data that obviously was showing percentages of their perceived capability, but I wanted to know the human essence as well of what that meant like. And that's how I stumbled across narrative, and I've been within narrative research since, where I'm actually often embed narrative into a mixed methods approach. So I will tell a large longitudinal sometimes, or sometimes even just a large scale story with the data, and then move into the complexities of what that looks like in human experience that's there as well. When we think about narrative research, there's a long intellectual tradition there. And so when we actually look at some of the educational psychologists or educationalists or within educational science, we start to really see that this idea of exploring human experience has been around in the literature for a very long time. And by lived experience, it's this idea of a personal understanding of something that's actually happened. So narrative, for example, it can show states of our development or our understanding at a specific point in time. It can also show different perspectives. So when we experience something together, my experience of it and somebody else's experience of it can be two different perspectives as well. So again, we can compare and contrast these different narratives. With this idea of it being an intellectual tradition, we have people like Brunner who suggests that narrative is actually a universal mode of thought, and it's actually a form of thinking. We often try and build our own understanding of what's happened to us by telling stories that are there. Oh, thank you, Caroline.
Sorry, yep.
Thank you, perfect. Good matching. So Brunner uses this idea that it is sort of the smallest cell of human thoughts, building on the work of Vygotsky, where narrative is the single most form of thought or thinking that's there. And that's why it's really important that when we are working and looking at social phenomena, we are exploring this idea of thinking that then is linked to narrative. So just moving on to the next slide, we can often have many different types of narratives that we tell as humans. And I'm going to get you to try and figure out what the story is around, or the narrative is behind this book. So this is a book that I had taken out from a library in Sweden, Ella in Solen, so Ella is in the sun. But there's a chunk missing out of the corner. And I had to return this book because something had happened in our household with this book. And I'd like you to try and have a go at what you think the narrative was that I told the librarian about this book. Why is this book missing its corner?
Your daughter is teething and she found a book delicious.
Well, that could be one narrative, that perhaps my daughter ate the book. Other ideas of what you thought might happen to this book?
Oh, I'm just putting it in the chat, but I think, and Julie said it as well, that it's a dog that's been chewed by a dog.
It got chewed by a dog? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it did actually get chewed by the dog and my daughter as well. So I was thinking, gosh, I'm going to be that academic who has to return a book to the library. And what story am I actually going to tell the librarian about this book? Will she actually believe me? So I had two choices to make as well. I could either tell a cover story or a cover narrative, which is where I would make something up about what happened to the book. Or I could share with the librarian this idea of a sacred story, which is my personal and very truthful experience of what actually happened to the book. And I thought long and hard about which one I should actually tell the librarian. And part of this as well is because I can speak some Swedish, but I'm not fluent in some Swedish as well. So I have to be very careful about the words that I'm actually using in my Swedish. So again, culture was playing into my experience as well that's there. So I actually ended up coming up initially with an idea that I'll just tell them that the book, something happened to the book, and maybe they're not going to ask. And sure enough, they didn't. So I was able to have this little truth somewhere between the cover narrative and a sacred narrative. But I just told them at the end as well that it was my daughter and dog that had eaten the book as well. But this is a very simple idea of narrative. When we are talking about some phenomena or issues, when we're talking with people, especially if they can be quite complex, participants will often tell us a cover story or a cover narrative, what they think we want to hear as researchers. So they're double guessing, or they're trying to predict what they want you to hear. And it often happens in interview data, where if we're not going back and developing a relationship with the research participants, they will tell us, the participant will tell us what they're participating or anticipating what we want to hear. But the idea is we have to build a relationship or some type of trust with the participant, which might include multiple interviews. So therefore we move beyond this idea of cover stories to actually sacred stories that are there. And when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. When you meet somebody for the first time, you're not going to tell them your intimate details about things. It's only through trust and perhaps regular meetings that you begin to then open and share little bits of your experience that are there. And this is what's really important in our narrative approach, is that we're wanting to try and really build these relationships to go for sacred narratives or sacred stories, rather than just receiving this idea of cover stories. Cover stories perhaps could be aligned with what Elliot Eisner calls is data rape, where researchers will go in, they will take the information, and they will never ever talk or make contact with research participants ever again. Part of narrative is about being respectful of the research participant, and some narrative traditions will actually call the participant a co-researcher or a co-contributor. to try and equal up the balance. And so part of it then, it's about having a shared understanding and a relationship that's based on trust. So just, are there any questions at all about the idea of cover stories or sacred stories?
I do have a question about ethics, because when I was applying, I'm using narrative methodology for my research, yes. And then I was being questioned multiple times about the need for multiple rounds of interviews. And I tried to cite literature to explain this whole thing that you were explaining, the need to build relationship and time, but I could only get away with 2 times of interviews rather than the suggested 3 times. And it actually got me thinking that, you know, what you mentioned about data rip and all, I wonder if I could actually get into know the participants a bit more before I actually intend to get the data. Would I be infringing on like the ethics procedure that I have explained to the committee? That it was strictly only 2 times, but would it be a little bit naughty if I were to, you know, try to establish a relationship outside of gathering data with the participants?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be fair within a narrative inquiry approach, because the research says, and I know from conducting narrative inquiries as well, is that once you're in the research field, so once you have or you're building this relationship and it's established, you never actually leave the research field either. And this is another area that's very problematic for ethics. That's there. So the idea is that by being respectful to the co-contributor, co-researcher or participant, if we all bundle that into the same idea, is that when you have a relationship, you have to continue that relationship unless there is strong grounds for why it won't actually continue that's there. So that could be things such as continuously sharing, or perhaps this participant feels like they need to make contact with you once even the research project is finished or complete.
What happened?
With interviews. Yep. He was saying that even things such as when you are doing interviews, you have to interview the same person minimum 2, maximum more, to actually look at this idea of collecting this information, but also allowing the processing to happen. And, you know, often if you just interview a person once off, you have the questions in your head. Oh, I wish I could have prompted this further. I wonder if this is what this person was actually saying. By having an additional interview or a follow-up interview, it gives you that opportunity to actually return and start to prompt some of those ideas that may have been there. When I have worked with some participants as well, there is no time limit on the sharing of information. So even though it might have been a 1-hour interview, if the data sharing or the interview is very sensitive, it can take quite a while. And it's not like you can say, oh, it's 1 o'clock, it's 1 hour now, I've got to go, bye-bye. Sometimes people will tell a sacred story, then they will remove themselves a little bit, then they'll come back to the sacred story, and we've got to allow for this time as well. So in some of the narrative research that I have done, it can take up to 3 hours, especially if you're visiting somebody and you're in their kitchen where they might have afternoon tea with you, they'll share a little bit, you might move on to a general conversation, and then you will come and revisit the topic multiple times that's there. So, yep.
Susie, could I just go back? You asked about, you spoke about the cover story.
Yep.
And it being called data rape. What if in my situation, it's the myth, the public narrative? Can I still call it a cover story?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the idea with we have cover stories, sacred stories. We also have big stories and small stories, or the stories of, or the stories about, that are complete opposites as well. So this is what you were talking about in regards to the public story. So there's the official narrative of what's happened, what's perhaps what's in the research literature, what's written in the media. And then that can be contrasted against the actual lived experience that's there as well. And this idea of the paired narrative is that within a story constellation approach or a narrative constellation approach that I interview, is that you can interview multiple people around the same experience, and it's how these different stories converge or diverge together. And what I mean by that is, in a school setting, I might interview a principal, I might interview a teacher, a parent, a child, and it's interesting to see how their stories collide or sometimes are very divergent in relation to the actual experience. So the example I'm thinking of is the research I've done on professional experience, where children were saying that when pre-service teachers come into their classroom, they're very upset because often they don't get a chance to say goodbye to the pre-service teacher. Parents were confused about why they're not consulted about pre-service teachers coming in with their children. And then there's also the power balances as well that are then happening between the pre-service teacher and the teacher within this experience of professional experience that's there. Any other questions or comments before I move on to this idea of paired stories further?
Gillian's got one. She's interested in the etymology of the term sacred story, if there's time to discuss that or to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of different narrative people have different terms for these. So either sacred stories, cover stories, big stories, little stories, for example. So it depends if you're working with Pockinghorn, Catherine Reisman, the work of Cheryl Craig, Clendinnen and Connolly, for example. So they will generally talk about similar ideas, but they will have different terminology for what they're actually using that's there. So the idea of sacred has very much come from Clendinnen's approach.
Terrific. Thank you.
So just moving on to the next slide is I'm showing you this as my own personal narrative that's there, because it shows two types or perhaps multiple stories that are happening at the moment around hotel quarantine. So we have the inquiry that's going on into hotel quarantine in Melbourne at the moment. We're watching the newspapers to see what's happening in regards to the daily changes, and every day seems to be different around the hotel quarantine, larger or official narrative. The government narrative was that people who were returning to Australia would spend 2 weeks in hotel quarantine. Since then, there's been, as I said, an inquiry into it. But my personal experience of narrative of hotel quarantine perhaps is a little different to the official stories that people are hearing. So hotel quarantine, it started off when my daughter and I left Sweden. So in these photos, you can see that she's very happy. She's traveling to the airport with her doll. We then caught the plane where I wore a face mask for up to 30 hours before hitting hotel quarantine in Melbourne. So we were in one of the last groups to actually enter into hotel quarantine in Melbourne. We then spent 2 weeks in our hotel room where we were not allowed outside at all. We did not have a window to the outside room, So in this third photo, my daughter's actually looking out into an atrium. So we could see sunlight coming in from the top, but we couldn't actually see anything outside that's there. So for 2 weeks, we were completely absorbed into various things in our room and how we could actually entertain ourselves. But there was also a lot of compassion that was shown, especially for my daughter during hotel quarantine. So the fabulous staff who delivered our food each day, they would often send my daughter messages on her food food bags, and you can see that there's one here. They started to call my daughter Princess Emily, because her name is Emily. So every day my daughter would get so excited because she would get a message from the outside world, from the kitchen staff, with a little message of these lunch bags. And I've actually kept all of these lunch bags because they're sort of very much an important part of our quarantine. And then on the last day, it was lovely because the kitchen staff wanted to do something very special for my daughter. So they actually went and bought her some donuts. So 2 hours before we got out of hotel quarantine, she was actually able to eat donuts. So our experience of hotel quarantine is our own unique personal experience of what happened during that time. And it's very different to what the official narrative was, but even what's happening at the moment in regards to the inquiry as well that's there. We had security guards who were very strict. As I said, we were never allowed outside. We were inside. And even things such as knocking on the doors, we would have to make sure that there was at least 2 minutes before we could open the door. So that was actually enforced there as well. But as I said, this is our personal experience of what happened during that time. So you can start to see then that this was our experience. However, other people's experience of hotel quarantine can be different as well. And that's been seen in the media of how some people were allowed out for shopping or for outside time, for exercise, etc. Again, it's acknowledging within narrative constellations that everyone has a unique experience of what's actually going on, but it's really important that we examine this idea of individual human thought that's there. So just moving on to the next slide. Oops.
You too many. There you go.
There we go. So it's this idea as well, as I've been talking about, of the official story versus the lived story. And it's about moving beyond this idea of cover stories to sacred stories. And being within the narrative paradigm or perspective, in some of the approaches, you move beyond this idea of participant to the person who is sharing the story is called a co-producer, co-researcher, co-collaborator. And this is very hard for ethics to actually understand this, because ethics are very traditional, based on power structures. And so this idea of having a co-producer or a co-researcher listed on a consent form is quite challenging. The other part of this is that when we map different people's perspectives side by side, we can start to see what alternate meaning and perspectives are created that's there, but also allowing us to think about things differently. So in regards to the example about professional experience that's there, one thing that was very interesting from the research that I was doing with parents around professional experience was that parents felt they had no say or control about the pre-service teacher that was coming into their actual classroom to work with their child. And so some of the parents were saying, you know, the curriculum documents in schools are about working with parents, it's about engaging with the community, but here we are, we feel a sense of empowerment because we can't report back to the supervising teacher about what our experiences has been with the pre-service teacher, or we can't give immediate feedback to the pre-service teacher either about how she talks to us and things like that. And again, this is in contradiction perhaps to what the curriculum in the school is saying, or perhaps some of the policies in the school are saying around engagement of families and communities that are there. Narratives are important when we're working with children as well to gain their insights and perspectives of things that are happening around them. And narrative research can also extend to children to giving them access to allow artifact recall. So that means we could use digital cameras or other types of artifacts where children can go around and document their experiences, and then they can come back, share and discuss with stories or narratives what these artifacts are as well. And that's been really important, especially in the research in museums, for example, where children were asked to go around and photograph different things that they liked and they didn't like in a museum, and then tell stories about what they liked and they didn't like. And the things that most of the children took photos of was actually the tape or the security fence around some of the artwork, because they felt that as an immediate exclusion, but also the height of some of the artwork, because it wasn't tailored towards their viewing. They would actually have to contort themselves to try and look up or down at the artwork itself. So again, these are different perspectives that children can actually bring to research that's there. As I was talking about as well, this idea of the research field is really important within narrative research. So research field, we enter the research field when we are meeting our co-producers, co-researchers, participant. But because we develop such strong trust, we can never actually leave the research field because we've built a relationship. And to just leave the research field because of the end of the research project is not a good enough reason within this philosophy or paradigm to actually terminate the relationship. The relationship is ongoing. It doesn't mean that you have to actively engage in the relationship, but it does mean that if you receive emails or phone calls from participants after the designated end date of the project, there is still a responsibility to engage in that relationship. And again, this is something that's a little bit tricky sometimes for ethics committees. When I talk to people like Jean Clandinin about this, she will say it's really important, especially when you are working with diverse groups, that the relationship there continues. And Vera Kane and her often cite the example of working with teenage boys who were very much disengaged from school, and the project was looking at why they were disengaged. But then also, even though the research project had finished, they were providing support there still for some of these boys that actually led to some of them going to university, being enrolled in university, being the referee or the support for them as they were gaining enrollment into the university. So there is a social aspect or perhaps a social support aspect that's here as well that the researcher may have to fulfill. Any questions? Because I'm doing a lot of talking.
Are there any ethical dilemmas you've had when approaching this methodology?
Definitely, absolutely. So I think there's different levels of ethical dilemma. Obviously, there's the ones of getting through the ethics committee, which you found out as well through some of the terminology or the approaches, especially around multiple interviews, so time series interviews, around consent sometimes, or even around the idea of assent that we use with children. But also there are sometimes, as I said, different ethical issues based on the research field itself, but new issues probably relate to the reporting of data. And I think that would be for many research projects itself. And what I mean by that is that if a child agrees to assent when they're 5, and they change their idea around consent when they're 18 and they're actually legal, what does that mean for data as well? So some of the questions that I'm thinking about at the moment, and I think this is bigger questions in itself around research, is that when you collect a story or when you collect an interview, it's a snapshot in time, and it's a snapshot of that participant in time itself. But the question, I think, is how long can we actually keep that snapshot, especially if assent is involved with children as well. And, you know, there's been quite a little bit written in some of the journals around this idea. So as I was saying, if a child agrees, or if their parents agree for the child to participate, and they're a minor, but then they suddenly become of legal age, what does that mean in regards to their representation as well that's in your research?
Thank you for that, Susie. It also brought me to thinking about like some of the issues that might come up as the respondents share their sacred stories. And you talked about the social role that sometimes the researcher has to play. Like we might find ourselves in certain positions where we have to share the intimate or confidential information that this
Yes.
participant share with us, because I'm thinking if we work with like at-risk youth, you know, or some marginalized communities, we might actually uncover certain problems which other people should know about. And when that arises, you would agree that we would have to then share this information.
Yeah.
But we would surely have to also share that with the participants, that this is something that's important, and I feel like I need to share with someone else, like the police or something.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is the duty of care as a researcher as well. And I think that the issues around duty of care, reporting, etc., it's not only unique to narrative, it's when we are working with diverse groups of people as well. And the duty of care is a legal responsibility as a researcher, but it's also very problematic about how you actually do this in practice, because it's one thing for it to be written in a document, but how do you actually handle it and carry it out? That's there. And Carolyn, you probably know policies better than me at the moment. There is probably some policy at Swinburne around reporting requirements for duty of care of research.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's anything that involves illegal activity, you're initially supposed to have flagged that could be a potential that comes up. But yes, you have reporting obligations around anything that harms someone else or illegal activity. Yeah, but you know, if you think that that's a possibility, usually that's if there's even a slight feeling from the ethics committee that something may get said, you're required to include protocols for dealing with that in your ethics application. And you know, you might think that you don't have any of that, but that you don't have a danger of that, but the ethics committee see far beyond what you will have seen in their careers, so they'll often make that recommendation just in case. These are the protocols, so they'll have had that pretty well covered. Yeah. Yeah. And we have a question from that was a great question. Thanks, Eugenia. From Michael Borthwick. What is the best practice for communicating with participants after the study is complete?
Yeah, and I think this is really important to know how you're actually going to communicate back, because different communities have different needs for communication. So there is obviously the stock standard one-page summary, but we can't assume that that's effective for all people. So other forms of communication could be perhaps like a brief session where people are invited in. Perhaps it's an online session where people can Zoom in. So it really depends on the needs. We can't assume as well that when we are doing our one-page summaries, that's very common now for feedback to participants, that all participants are literate and that all participants actually understand the content that is in there. So I would suggest multiple formats actually. But again, it's knowing the community really well to know what is the best action in regards to communication.
Terrific. Does anyone have any other questions they want to add in there? you've wowed them, Susie. They're thinking
No,
hard.
no. I'm picking up the questions at the same time here as well, which is good. So Bamberg as well is another person that I see that's in the comments, definitely in regards to narrative that's there. And Bamberg takes very much a discourse or a thematic approach into the actual analysis. The other part to consider is depending on which narrative tradition you use, it will change the type of analysis that you're actually doing. So Pockinghorn, for example, has analysis of narrative analysis that you would implement. Clendenin and Connolly have this idea of borrowing, borrowing, and becoming in regards to the analysis, so the 3 stages that the data actually moves through. Even Catherine Reisman, it's sometimes looking at the chunks of meaning that are in there as well and really trying to figure out what is going on there. And with all of the narrative analysis though, or the approaches, it means that you're coming back to the data multiple times as well. It's not just one iteration that it's done, it's coming back multiple times to look at the different meanings that could be in there as well. Cheryl Craig, I left her off the list. This is where the idea that I have built on with narrative constellations come from, because she embeds the approach of story constellations. Cheryl Craig also uses a lot of literacy or literary features in her story constellations. So things like metaphors, and she will actually engage the participants to co-write the metaphor as a title in there that's often really powerful. I use value statements when I'm undertaking narrative constellations. And again, I negotiate these with the participants. So what I will do is either ask the participants to come up with a value statement. So arts education is, and get them to fill out what they would like for the end. And then we can have a talk about what is the best that actually shapes or is the overarching of their story. And then the other part of this is that when I am writing my narrative constellation, it often reads like a story. So the idea is that you put in the pauses because they're important. You put in how you're thinking or you're feeling as you're talking to the research participant and how they're actually responding to you as well. You talk about the context or the environment that's around you within it. So the idea is that it is a descriptive narrative that's taken part between yourself and the research participant within this constellation, but also within it, there are little stories that sometimes have their own subheadings as well. And this particular approach, once I've drafted it, I will then send it to the research participant or the co-producer and say, look, is this how you'd like to be represented in my research? And sometimes they'll say, oh, you know, I didn't actually think of myself like this before. Perhaps you could say this. Or they might want to change something or edit something or discuss something further. That's all okay as well, because it's about a negotiation process that's going on between you and the participant as well. I also let the participants choose their pseudonym that they would like to choose for their identity, and then also for the name of their school or their location or their city, for example. And it's really interesting because one day I had a participant who was very keen to say, you know, I want the government to listen. You put my name in there, and if they have any questions, they can come and talk to me. They were very adamant about that. And it was just through a negotiation of talking about ethics and things that they started to realize that maybe a pseudonym was better. But again, these are the conversations that you have with the participants as well. So it's a very open process that's there. And because this trust has been built, you can have those open conversations as well. I just saw one question that popped up as well when I was there. Oh, no.
Yeah, is that we've got Eugenia. How would you recommend methods of presenting these narrative data? If that's still relevant for you, Eugenia?
I think Susie's managed to cover some of those just now. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. And Gillian, you've started to ask a question that hasn't come out. Do your participants work in a group?
Yeah, so you could do this two ways depending on how you want to approach it. You can have the individual interviews where you're building that trust and relationship, or you could do it sometimes as a group, like a focus group as well that's there. I've done it both ways that are there. But the problem is, I think sometimes in a focus group is that not everyone will um, will have a buy-in into what the main ideas are that are coming out of the focus group. So it's just to ensure that there is that collectiveness within the focus group or the group that's there. Perhaps it may be better to work in partnerships, for example. So perhaps, again, it depends on the actual context. When I have interviewed multiple teachers in the same school site, I have actually found that they will often have divergent views, even though the same official story would be there. So again, it just depends on the context and what you're actually investigating.
I'm wondering if you could make some comment about how this might apply to an action research approach. I'm doing research on an emerging concept, and I've been interviewing some of the leaders of that concept with the view to kind of work towards a coherent story that then can help them advance their work. Yeah, so if you could maybe make some comment about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You could combine or embed this with an action research approach as well. So with the leaders, I assume that you're interviewing them multiple times or across multiple points. Yeah, definitely. And so then it would also be about sometimes taking back things that they might have said previously, getting them to reflect on it, also looking and getting them to think about change in the process. I think with action research, the difference perhaps to narrative is just the philosophical foundations that are there, but they can definitely be embedded. And that's the thing with narrative as well, is that you can use it as a method or you can use it as a methodology. So depending on what your needs are or what your phenomena is, what your research questions are, your epistemology, your ontology, you can then embed or integrate or have the philosophical foundation of narrative, just depending on your need as well. So what this means as well is that when people talk about narrative, they often mean it as a method, but it can actually be a methodology as well. So if you're talking about somebody like Clendenin, Cheryl Craig, it's very much a methodology. When you're talking with somebody, even like Pockinghorn sometimes, it then becomes a method. And then depending on the approach that you are using as well depends on your level of reflexivity. And so if you are engaging with most of the narrative people that I've mentioned, reflexivity is an important part also for the credibility, for the trustworthiness of the data. And what I mean by that is that it's sharing your own story as well, because you have come from a position or an experience to undertake this research. So your story will often appear in your thesis as well if you're engaging with narrative, whether it be in chapter 1 where your story, you're telling it of your own personal experience and this is how you've come to know the research problem or the research phenomena that's under study, or it may be that you are sharing your reflexivity in your methods section when you're talking about, again, your own relationship. And then again, this might come back in the end of your thesis. When I did my doctoral thesis, I had it in my first chapter where I was talking about the official literature, what it says about the research problem, but then also my personal experience with the research problem. So then straight away, there's this idea of a paired story approach. In my final chapter as well, just jumping back to the research participants, one thing I found when I was sharing their narratives at conferences or with other academics, etc., they'd always want to know what happened to these 4 research participants. So in my final chapter, I actually gave an update of what had happened since I had undertaken the research with them as well. And that was really interesting because it was just at the end of the thesis, after the conclusion, it was like update on the research participants. And people would often comment that it was really helpful to see what those people were actually engaged with or doing now.
Yeah, that's terrific. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Loretta.
Oh yeah, I just had another question about the anonymity of the co-producers or research participants. Are you aware of any times where they've actually been nominated? Because at the moment with my research, they're actually going to be acknowledged and named. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question in itself because it depends on accountability, obviously, with them sharing the information to you, but also the ethical requirement around anonymity or the use of pseudonyms. And so I'm just thinking in my head, is it a general acknowledgement? So, all the leaders who were involved in
No, they're actually going to be named. They're actually, they want to be named. And it's also come up, I've actually been to a couple of seminars that have been run by Indigenous scholars, and they're saying in that space that's actually coming up because people don't want to be separated from their stories. They don't want their sacred stories to then become an anonymous. They want to be associated with it. And that's certainly my experience, that these people who are developing this concept, they definitely want to be associated and identified as with what I'm doing.
And is it at the point where you will be able to tell who says what, or is it more at a general level where, these are the people who participated and they can't really be identified in the data set?
Yeah, so I suppose what they'll get identified on is any papers that they've written or documents or blogs, etc., because they're all practitioners that then get associated. But in terms of the actual primary data collection, no, it'll be that they've participated in this stage of the research.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting, it's a really interesting point because I have had participants who are very adamant about they wanted to be named. And at that point in time as well, I would often talk to ethics about what the requirements were around de-identification and things like that. But it's interesting because, like any research, boundaries always change as well. So perhaps there is movement there as well around this idea. So I'm really interested and keen to see how it actually develops. Okay, other questions or comments around narrative?
Historic narrative.
Yes.
Would you like to talk to that a little?
Absolutely. So again, you can have historical narratives as well, which is can be based on many different data sources coming in. You can use similar ideas of official and then lived experience, depending on what your data sets are. But it depends on how you're actually going to embed historical elements in there. So is it something that you're researching at the moment?
It's something yes, I am, and there's multiple different data sets. So speeches, official policy, institutional formations. So to number some of the elements, and then comparison studies.
So, I mean, it depends if you want to have a story within each data set or within institution or, you know, however you're actually going to group within this historical as well. So it just depends on what the purpose is of the historical narrative. Two questions, I think, when anyone is undertaking narrative research or any research in general is the so what and who cares. And if you can answer both of those questions, you've done narrative research or research in general very well.
Terrific. I'll go on. A question? No? Yeah, I love Gillian's made an interesting observation there. That about that she wishes she'd provided pseudonyms for the schools that, or she'd asked her participants to provide pseudonyms from the school, and that, as you suggested, that so it's probably too late to go back and undo that now. But excellent advice.
And I mean, I think the other thing as well is if you are really keen to be more involved with narrative research, the American Education Research Association has a very strong narrative network within it. And when they have the AERA conference, they will often have a pre-conference for doctoral students. So that's a great point to actually be involved, share, have feedback about the narrative research that you're actually doing. And then there are also a few emerging narrative groups across Europe as well, especially out of the education research associations.
Another, I suppose, reflection I wanted to share is in doing these interviews, I have been lucky that I've, because of Zoom or having to do things online, I've recorded all of the sessions. And when I've gone back over, I've realised how much I missed in that first, you know, listening to the story. And yeah, it's really made me think about how well I've listened and collect that story. Anyway, it was just something that I think would be really, it's probably relevant to all research, but it just seems like it's quite significant here.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think we need reflection processes built into when we're collecting data, whether it be, you know, audio recordings or Zoom recordings or whatever, because it gives us a chance to actually process the conversation, but also think about how we can probe things next time that's there. And I mean, I think this is really important. When I have conducted research, I will always keep a research diary as well. So that will allow me to continuously reflect on what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, but also to come up with new ideas that are there. Especially after interviews, I will often write how I thought it was, how I thought it went. So certain reflections, and then I will come back to that over time as well to just try and create, you know, new insights or new ways of seeing the data that's prompted from reflection.
Terrific. Yeah, I think that research diary is just such an essential thing, regardless of if you're doing interviews or not, just even recording and engaging with the things that you're reading. And it means that you've got a repository that you can go back to after a year or two or, you know, year and a half of distance between when you first encountered something and when you're ready to start thinking about writing it up or to start building on that, because that's such a long time in a thinker's brain, isn't it?
It is.
And if you're a part-time student, like, and that's like 8 years for a PhD. So super great suggestion.
Yeah. And also just for understanding why you made decisions at certain points.
Yep. Yeah. And Michael Borthwick asks, are people transcribing their own interviews? Tossing it out to all of us here, and perhaps Michael's feeling a bit tired, like, oh, this is such a big job.
I see there's one comment.
Professional services.
Yeah.
We've discovered otter. One of our wonderful colleagues, Greg Every, suggested otter, and it's been amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I think that Susie, as we're wrapping up, somebody asked me the other day, does Swinburne have a policy around requiring students to transcribe at least some of their own interviews before they then engage a professional transcriber? And that I'm aware of, we don't. But I thought, what a great idea, really. And that must be so valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, and especially finding where the nuances or the other information is in that interview as well. So what I mean by that is the ums, the ahs, the pauses, etc. These are really important insights. And I think if you just send it off to a transcription company, sometimes you miss these little subtleties that are huge.
Yep, sure. Wow, a lot of enthusiasm for transcribing and for otter. Terrific. Any further questions before we wrap it up there? Terrific. All right, a big round of Zoom applause for Susie. Thank you so much. And you braved some tech issues before I came and probably made them worse. So apologies for that. And thank you so much. And what we'll do is we will send out a list of the scholars that Susie's mentioned, because Eugenia has so kindly been noting them down the side and has provided some additional resources as well. And I know I just find this incredibly fascinating. I've heard people talk about how great your work is, Susie, around this area. So we're so privileged to have heard this today. Wonderful. And so, yeah, did you have any final words to share with us, Susie?
I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming today. It's fantastic that you're interested in narrative research, and you can send me an email anytime at my Swinburne address.
Terrific. Thank you. All right. Well, we look forward to hearing you all presenting on your narrative research in the future. Wonderful. Cool. And I'll disseminate. I've recorded this, and if just checking, which I didn't check ahead of time, if that's okay with Susie. Now I'll put her on the spot. Oops. Very unethical. Never do that. Caroline, naughty. Then, yeah, we can disseminate that as well. So terrific. Yeah. All right. Go and have some lunch and enjoy some sun.
Yeah. Have a good afternoon.
See ya. Thanks.